Welcome to Face to Face. I'm Derek Conway and we're joined today by Lord Carlisle of Berriew, who is the United Kingdom's independent reviewer for terrorist legislation. Lord Carlisle, thank you for joining us. I've known you for 28 years as Alex Carlisle. Many viewers obviously know your title, but they're not necessarily sure what it involves. So what if you just explain to us what it is precisely that you do?
My role involves reviewing the operation, the working of counter-terrorism legislation in the UK. I also advise on government proposals for new counter-terrorism legislation. The work is theoretical and practical. Theoretical in that I look at legal concepts and the way in which the law is interpreted in the courts. Practical in that I go, for example, and stand behind police officers at airports and seaports to see how they stop and examine people, or watch police officers stopping and searching people in the streets. So I look at the whole range of counter-terrorism legislation.
So you like to see how the law is working, not just the theory of the law as a lawyer. You want to see how it's put out in practice.
Yes, and I write reports. I write at least 3 reports a year on different aspects of counter-terrorism law. The reports have to be published.
Do you think the general public really supports what's going on? I mean, do you deal directly with the Home Office? You're an experienced lawyer. Do you deal with the police? Or do you report to Parliament when you...
I'm appointed by the Home Secretary, so I report to the Home Secretary. But the Home Secretary has to publish my reports, and indeed they remain for some years on the Home Office website, so that the public at large can have access to them. And indeed, it's always my wish that the public at large should have access to me as well as independent reviewer if they wish to do so. And I have a great deal of interaction, mostly by email, with members of the public.
And if the Home Secretary doesn't like what you're saying, I mean, presumably somebody are able to take up and talk about future legislation, whatever, or practices, but if he doesn't agree with you, I mean, does it become a fairly robust exchange? Does he say, I'm sorry, Lord Carlisle, I just can't accept what you're saying?
Well, there can be robust exchanges, though on the whole, the government has been quite amenable to various suggestions I've made. If I can give you an example of something they haven't accepted, we have things called control orders, which restrict the movements of a small number of people who are resident of the United Kingdom. I've said that control orders should not generally, save in exceptional circumstances, last for more than 2 years. The government has not accepted that. But my views are published, and the government publishes its response as well. So the difference between us, where it exists, is there for everyone to see.
Because I think in your last report, I seem to recall reading on this control orders that you thought maybe people could be kept under watch, but on a sort of slightly more relaxed basis, maybe not access the internet or whatever. But the government so far is not prepared to go down that route.
Well, what I recommended is that a small number of people who are on control orders could be removed from control orders and placed on what I call travel restriction orders. Yeah. The government, in its response, which has been published in the last week, has said that they're looking at that proposal with interest. Of course, a general election has intervened. Whichever government is elected on May the 6th is bound to have a good look at all our counter-terrorism law. And I hope that whatever government we have, we shall have counter-terrorism law in one place, consolidated, and capable of lasting for a long time.
And does the legislature get involved? Are you called to go before, say, the Home Affairs Select Committee and give evidence to them, or explain your reports to them, or discuss with them what options are?
I think I've given evidence to every possible committee, and there are many of them in Parliament, in both houses of the British Parliament at various times. And of course I publish my views so that they're well known, and indeed they've been referred to, my reports have been referred to very frequently in courts and in reports, in courts in the UK and elsewhere, and in various reports and academic articles that have been written over the years.
Is there a network? I mean, do you have a German equivalent or a French equivalent? Or a network of independent reviewers hopping around Europe or America looking?
Interestingly, there is no network. In fact, the United Kingdom at the moment is the only country that has an independent reviewer of terrorism legislation. Australia is about to appoint its first independent monitor of terrorism legislation, and I've had detailed conversations here and in Australia about the way in which that role can operate. I think the new independent Australian monitor may be a better developed model than our own, but I would say that because it gives him some statutory powers, whereas I don't have powers as such, I have influence. In Canada, they have an Inspector General of much of the area that I'm independent reviewer of, but he is a civil servant. He's not set out to be an independent reviewer in the way in which I am. In other countries, I know of no equivalent, though it has been considered in some other Commonwealth countries.
Do you find that over the 9 years you've been doing this job, that your terms of reference have changed? And when you were appointed, Irish republicanism was a big issue. Now it's Islamist extremism. How have you found that has changed how you look at your responsibilities?
Well, interestingly, on the day on which I was appointed, I thought I was only going to have to look at Irish terrorism. But that was the day of 9/11. And so by halfway through the day, the whole job had changed. That was just an unfortunate coincidence. But it meant that it was a much greater responsibility than I had at first anticipated.
But has that, because of these changes, do you think it's changed the ground rules? I mean, for example, stop and search, which has clearly been a big issue, particularly in London, where you have a much more diverse population than likely find in the parts of the UK that we're from. And yet, nobody seems to be really making a lot of progress on that, and yet it's something you've expressed strong views on.
The havoc and terror that terrorism has caused led to reactive legislation. Some of that legislation was introduced in a hurry, and I have a very strong view that emergency legislation introduced and passed through Parliament in a hurry often turns out to be not very good. And that has certainly happened. Now, on stop and search, this is not at ports of entry, but in the streets of the United Kingdom, there has been a great deal of activity by the police. That is activity which I have complained about on many occasions. I think there should be far fewer stops and searches by the police. The number has been reduced dramatically, possibly partly as a result of my intervention. Recent court decisions have meant that stop and search will be reduced yet further, and my belief is that stop and search without suspicion should occur only very, very rarely and in certain very restricted circumstances. Stop and search with suspicion that someone is a terrorist is perfectly reasonable, because the police in every country stop and search people who they suspect of committing a crime or being about to commit a crime. I don't think anyone can complain about that. Stop and search has a particular community impact, and I have been concerned not only about the exercise of the police powers and where they fall or do not fall in the civil liberties agenda, but I've been concerned too about the fact that perhaps a disproportionate number of Muslims have been stopped and searched, which should not occur.